Hi everyone, my name is Dennis Hopkins and welcome to my presentation. My presentation is titled The Prairie Dog Wars. So let's start with an introduction. The Great Plains stretches across the central part of the United States and is bounded by the Mississippi River and the Rocky Mountains. Numerous species call the Great Plains home, but one species is at the heart of a century-old dispute that has the government, landowners, and conservationists at odds, the black-tailed prairie dog. As a keystone species, the prairie dog plays a crucial role in the health of a large portion of the Great Plains and are connected to over 150 different species in some crucial way. Considered a pest by many, hundreds of thousands of prairie dogs have been poisoned and shot over the past 100 years. Even to this day, the U.S. government is involved in the mass poisoning of prairie dogs. This presentation seeks to understand how and why we got to this point and where we go from here. So let's start with a bit about prairie dogs. There are 5 species of prairie dogs, and they all belong to the Sciuridae, or the squirrel family. The black-tailed prairie dog is the most abundant species of the Great Plains. Black-tailed prairie dogs are extremely social animals that have family groups called coteries, consisting of multiple males, females, and pups. These coteries are then interconnected into larger units called colonies or towns. Historically, black-tailed prairie dogs had a vast range in the Great Plains. Based on journal entries and government records, it is estimated that the prairie dog range once extended nearly 100 to 250 million acres and may have numbered in as many as 5 billion individuals. The largest colony ever documented in 1905 was in Texas and stretched for 25,000 square miles. Prairie dogs are unique in that they create something called the prairie dog ecosystem. Through their extensive digging, prairie dogs play a unique role by creating an ecosystem that affects both the soil and vegetation in the prairie. Prairie dogs spend an enormous amount of time clipping short and mixed grasses and trimming the shrub-like plants around their burrows. Not only are they eating the grass, but they are also clearing the colony of plants that will prevent them from seeing predators. There is continuous churning of soil and clipping of grass creates the prairie dog ecosystem, where they help to add nitrogen and nutrients to the soil and stimulate new plant growth. Prairie dogs are also considered a keystone species. As mentioned, the prairie dog's colonies create a rich environment that nearly 150 other animals either depend on or use for resources. Many ungulates, such as bison, elk, and pronghorn, are attracted to the young vegetation which is in the constant state of regrowth due to the prairie dogs. Burrowing owls use the abandoned prairie dog tunnels for nesting, and the near-extinct black-footed ferret typically feeds exclusively on prairie dogs and use their abandoned tunnels for homes. Humans and prairie dogs. In the early 20th century, much of the land in the Great Plains was converted to ranching or agriculture. Early on, many landowners, ranchers, and farmers considered prairie dogs to be pests. The primary complaints around prairie dogs centered on the following. Prairie dogs were consuming all the grass the cattle needed to eat. The prairie dog tunnels and colonies were creating barren land where grass could not grow. Prairie dog tunnels are dangerous for cattle and could break their legs. Many also just considered prairie dogs simply vermin. Many of these reasons led to massive extermination efforts. To understand why so many people consider prairie dog extermination an acceptable practice, we must understand the perceptions of the prairie dog itself. First, we must realize that throughout most of the 20th century, it was not known the pertinent role the prairie dog played in the prairie ecosystem, and that so many species were reliant on them. The second idea we must understand is that landowners and the government felt the prairie dogs were merely vermin and directly responsible for damaging the land and competing with their cattle to the available grass. Finally, since prairie dogs are vermin, by default, they have no intrinsic value. This leads us to the questions about the ethics of extermination. This quote provides us with a good introduction to that question. Farmers, ranchers, and developers see land as a fixed resource. Their livelihoods depend on the ability to control that landscape. Prairie dogs disrupt that control. This modern sentiment captures the essence of the argument as to why the extermination of prairie dogs has been so extensive and continues to this day. It's all about the control and protecting one's right to a livelihood. This idea has very old roots and is at the core of liberal individualism. Locke even states that no one should harm another one's life, which includes health, liberty, or possessions. Persons had a God-given right to their body, the land he/she owned, the fruits of that labor, and his/her money. In other words, prairie dogs threatened the landowner's right. Since prairie dogs were no more than vermin and capable of so much destruction, naturally extermination was an acceptable course of action. These ideas led to the massive extermination and the Federal ADC Act. While the poisoning of the prairie dogs began in the 19th century, it came to the forefront with the USDA-approved Animal Damage Control Act, established in 1931. This act allowed for the federal government to develop and implement programs on both public and privately held land to eradicate mountain lions, wolves, coyotes, bobcats, and prairie dogs, and other wildlife injurious to livestock and other human interests. Between 1916 and 1920, humans poisoned prairie dogs over the entire range at the time, a total of about 100 million acres of western rangeland. These extermination efforts continue to this day. In fact, in 2018, Colorado used lethal methods such as poison on 18,000 prairie dog burrows. So, what is the current state of prairie dogs? Due to habitat loss, extermination efforts, sport killing, and the sylvatic plague, the prairie dog range has been reduced by 95%. Many efforts are being made to protect the remaining prairie dog colonies found throughout the western U.S. There have been numerous attempts to put the black-tailed prairie dog on the endangered species list. Even though the U.S. Fish and Wildlife recognizes the black-tailed prairie dogs as keystone species, all petitions have failed because of the frequency and size of the populations, while fragmented, are still rather large. Given that their competing interests with continuing to exterminate them and consider them as pests, and many efforts to conserve the prairie dog, what is the way forward? Well, we could say that while a lot of work has been done to protect the black-tailed prairie dog, they are still in continuous danger. In order to find a path forward, it is crucial that the government and landowners recognize that prairie dogs do have intrinsic value as keystone species and are integral to the health and well-being of the plains and the numerous other species. Outside evaluation, it's imperative that as a society we recognize that the prairie dogs are part of our community, and we must extend them the same respect and kindness we would for any community member. These ideas and values are aligned with care ethics, where concerns for others, their feelings, and the need to not inflict harm are major concerns. For example, near Boulder, Colorado, they have learned to coexist with prairie dogs and allow them to build colonies on public lands that are interspersed with communities and public land. Rather than extermination or relocation, they have acknowledged that the prairie dogs bring immense value to both their community and their environment. Fox and Beckhoff offer some basic principles that should be used when considering a relationship to prairie dogs and direct our future decisions. Do no intentional harm, treat all animals with respect and compassion, and recognize that all animals have intrinsic worth, irrespective of their utility to other animals. I would like to close with thank you for viewing my presentation, and I look forward to all of your feedback. Have a great night.